What led you to the decision to make Malignance a mana item specifically? It was actually more that I wanted to make a mana item that was different from the other mana items, and that led me down the path to create Malignance. So this is the full story of Malignance. When I was making the mana item structure, when I was redoing the AP system for Season 14, I looked at the Mythic structure and I said, the idea that all mages are expected to buy a Lost Chapter item and then they get freedom to buy whatever, AP items they want, that made sense to me. And I thought that that was fine to keep, right? It's like, mages in some ways sort of still have mythics in the sense that like you're picking a Lost Chapter item and then you pick your other items. But that structure wasn't, I didn't think that structure was like broken or anything or like non-functional. It worked fine. However, when I looked at the mythic mana items, there were several problems. Number one, Liandry's, let's be honest, it should not be a mana item, right? Like it's a very broadly appealing generic item that should be available for champions like, say, Singed and for Rumble. And it's just like a linchpin item that I think shouldn't be a mana item. So I was like, immediately I said, Liandry's, you're not a mana item anymore. Okay. So I need to replace that. And Everfrost also is just not an acceptable item in League of Legends, right? It's like, it means that, for example, Ahri doesn't get to deal damage because her charm always lands. So therefore, her charm combo is not allowed to deal a lot of damage because we have to tune it around the fact that she's going to buy Everfrost and guaranteed land her charm every time. There's a lot of mages like that where if we give you the ability to point and click your spells, your champion is not fun because we have to tune their combo around that, right? Like Vhagar is very similar, yes. So Everfrost was immediately like, cut, don't look back. I've never once considered re-adding Everfrost, right? And so I was looking at the mana structure and saying, okay, Ludens, that item is great. I would trim some mechanics, but I need mana items in the Lost Chapter slot to make sense in this structure. I moved Archangels and Seraph's Embrace back in there because it made sense to have a defensive option, and then Ludens was the offensive option. And then I was saying, hey, I need a third option that isn't offense or defense, some kind of utility. I considered a bunch of different options, right? One of the things I tested for what it's worth was Meteor from Wild Rift. I called it Orbital Laser, where you could call down from long range a gigantic, laser, meteor from the sky. Well, that was the idea of theming. The actual reality was it looked like Redemption because that was my temp VFX. I tested a number of different things that all didn't really feel like they worked for feeling super different from Ludens or Seraphs. And at one point, I was just looking at different things that I could give them, and I said, okay, what about ultimate, right? Like, there are a lot of mages that care a lot about their ultimate. So what if I just made a Lost Chapter item that gave you a lot of ult haste? So I made a Lost Chapter item that had 20 regular haste and 30 ultimate haste. It was crazy, right? Like, obviously this item was not shippable, but I was like, okay, literally, is this item interesting at all, right? Are there champions that would actually take this or, like, be interested in this shape over something like a Ludens or something like a Seraphs? And the answer pretty quickly in testing was obviously yes, right? Like, people were buying it on Lissandra, people were buying it on Malzahar, people were buying it on Lux. They were like, wow, this is fun. I get to cast my ult a lot. And so then the question I had was, okay, if I tune the amount of ult haste to an acceptable amount, what is the secondary effect I can find to go with ultimate haste on this Lost Chapter item that makes this unique, different, and actually interesting comparatively to the other two Lost Chapter items you have available? And after a bunch of conversations, bunch of talking around, getting people's ideas, I don't even remember where this idea came from. I think the idea for your ultimate damage does something special came from a conversation I had with Triptoid and Phlox, but I don't remember who came up with the idea, to be honest. So I then leapt from your ult damage does something different to your ult damage burns the ground beneath them, which shreds them, which then makes it exciting to follow up on, because at the time I was still thinking a lot about like Lissandra and Malzahar use cases. And I put that in the game. And pretty immediately, with my very hacky implementation that I put in at first, pretty immediately it was like, oh, this is just cool. Like this works pretty well. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of people, even internally, were skeptical on Malignance, that this would occupy a sufficient space to make sense as a Lost Chapter item. In fact, actually, one of the really interesting, one of the most probably like the second most validated I've ever felt at my job was Froxon actually wanted to cut the item. He wanted to replace it with something else. He wanted me to make another item there. And myself and Soul Crushed, alongside Gat at the time, were like, no, this item, it's good. Like, it actually works. And so Froxon said, okay, I'll back off. Like, you can ship the item. But, he was like, I don't think that it will quite work. 1 month after we shipped Season 14, I had a one-on-one with Froxon where he was like, you know what? You were right about Malignance. You were absolutely right to like defend this item and ship it. It actually is really good. Like, it actually does add this really interesting new dimension that is very different from the other Lost Chapter items. And that was really cool. It was very validating to hear like, hey, the design stakeholder on my project said like, hey, I think you should cut this, replace it with something else. I pushed back. I got the support I needed to push back on that and say like, no, this is actually good. And full circle, like, ship the item and validated, like, yep, it was actually good. I was right to hold on and like defend the item when it would have been probably easier for me, to be honest, to just like cut it and try and make a new one at that point. Because that was still very early on. That was, I don't know, I think I had like 4 or 5 months at that point before we shipped, because the AP item rework was done very, very, very early.
Highest win rate champs in the league are not the skill ceiling champs. Players find that macro win them games more than micro. Do you think skill champs need a buff? So a very common misconception is win rate is directly representative of overall power when compared across champions. It's the idea that just because this champion wins a higher percentage of their games, they're just like objectively better than another character, and that's just a really strong misconception. A really easy way to think about this is, fun fact, did you know that many champions are being, in your games right now, are being played by people who have not played a lot of games on them? We'll start with that. Turns out in League of Legends, at some point, you have to be new at a champion. And there's a lot of champions, and people like trying out new stuff, right? So because of that, surprise, surprise, if you're new at a champion, you won't win as much. And some champions, especially the hard-to-play ones, are going to be more punishing for being bad at them. And so you could see a world, as an example, where a champion with a high skill cap would actually have a lower average win rate because of all the new players bringing them down, as an example. That could be true, given the champion and who plays it. A very common misconception about old Aurelian's Soul was that he was only played by his mains, and that's why his win rate was so high. But if you actually looked at who played him, there's actually a very meaningful number of people who weren't actually very good at him that were playing him and trying him out and then bouncing off. So yeah, but the idea that like skillful characters having lower win rates represents them being weaker is kind of, I'd say, incorrect. A lot of skillful characters tend to have lower win rates because if you're not very good at them, like, you'll lose more, but then if you get good at them, you win a lot more. And so, as an example of what I'm talking about here, we can like talk about Yasuo. Yasuo has like basically a win rate curve based on mastery that goes up like this. So basically, if you start out on Yasuo, you're pretty bad, and you're going to lose a lot of games. And it turns out there's a decent number of people out there who think Yasuo's cool and are trying him out. And then if you have like 100 games on Yasuo, your ability to win the game just keeps going up and up and up and up and up and up and up. And so Yasuo is a character who, when mastered, is stronger than his win rate would represent, because mastering him returns more and more and more and more and more win rate, and there is a real number of people who play Yasuo who do not have, the 100 games, as an example. On the flip side of things, really, really easy champs tend to not have a lot of mastery. An example of this would be like a character like, say, Malphite. There's only so much you can do to get good at Malphite, right? He's kind of straightforward. And so Malphite having a higher average win rate, that's some indication of he's easier to pick up, potentially. But he's also not going to have as much of a cap as a character like, as high of a mastery ceiling as a character like Yasuo. And that can often mean that a Malphite that has the same win rate as Yasuo, if you compared them to each other, if Malphite has the same win rate as Yasuo, that can often be an indication that one of them is imbalanced. Either Malphite is too weak, or Yasuo is too strong if they have the same win rate. And then this all gets even more complicated because you have to consider like how many games the average player has on a character. So another example here is Yasuo is actually insanely highly mained. And so the average Yasuo in your game actually has a lot of games on him compared to, say, the average Malphite you run into. And that would increase his win rate. Because the average Yasuo then would be higher on the mastery curve. So there's a lot of crazy stuff that goes into thinking about win rates. But do not be misled by the idea that two characters with the same win rate are exactly the same state of power.